By late afternoon, the sea had turned the color of tarnished silver. From the upstairs study of the old house, Mara could see the tide pulling away from the shore in long, reluctant sighs, exposing strips of dark sand and rock below the bluff. Wind worried at the window panes. Somewhere downstairs, a door clicked softly in its frame with each draft that moved through the halls. She had spent the day trying to make herself useful, dusting shelves that did not need dusting, straightening books no guest would touch, rearranging the brass compass on the mantel for the third time. The house had 8 bedrooms, 3 sitting rooms, and the hollow grandeur of a place built for a louder life than the one it held now. Her husband, Daniel, called it a blessing. Mara sometimes thought of it as a beautifully furnished silence. She was kneeling beside the cedar chest under the window when she heard the study door open behind her. She turned too quickly, one hand still clutching the thing she had just pulled from the chest. Julian stopped in the doorway. For one brief, terrible second, neither of them moved. In Mara's hand was an old leather portfolio, the corners worn pale with age. A ribbon of sketches had slipped partway loose from it, charcoal studies of a woman's hands, a woman's face reflected in rain-dark glass, a woman leaning over a balcony with the sea behind her. All of them unmistakably alive. All of them unmistakably intimate. Not drawings by her. Drawings of her. Her breath caught. Julian's gaze went first to the portfolio, then to her face. He looked as if he had stepped into the room by accident and found not a person, but a confession. "I didn't know you still had those," he said quietly. Mara rose too fast, pushing the drawings back into the case with clumsy hands. "I should have thrown them away." But she hadn't. Julian crossed one ankle over the other and rested one shoulder against the doorframe, not entering, not leaving. There was nothing careless in his expression. That somehow made it worse. He had arrived 3 days ago from London to restore the old boathouse at the edge of the property, a favor to Daniel, who knew him through a museum board and thought highly of his work. Mara had met him only once before, 2 summers earlier, at a gallery opening in the city. He had been charming then in the effortless way some men are charming without seeming to notice they are. This week, in the house by the sea, he had been quieter, more observant, as if he listened even when no one was speaking. She had not expected him to recognize the portfolio. She had not expected him to be the artist who had drawn those sketches 15 years ago. "Please," she said, hating the thinness in her own voice. "Don't." Julian's eyes softened, though he did not look away. "I'm not mocking you. That doesn't make it better." At that, something like regret crossed his face. Years ago, before Daniel, before the house, before the small daily erosion of her into someone composed and practical and mostly invisible, Mara had spent one summer on the Amalfi Coast with her sister. Julian had been there on a residency, drawing every church archway, fishing dock, and weather-creased face he could find. They had spent 12 days in the same circle of artists and wanderers, walking narrow stone streets at dusk, arguing over paintings in terrible Italian, drinking too much wine in little squares where musicians played until midnight. Nothing had happened, or at least nothing one could point to cleanly and call an event. A touch at the small of her back when a scooter rushed too close. A shared umbrella in a sudden rainstorm. A look held a fraction too long over candlelight. The knowledge of possibility, and then the decision, on both sides or neither, to leave it untouched. A month later, she had met Daniel. She had married a good man, people always said. Reliable. Distinguished. Kind in the measured, undramatic way that made gratitude feel like obligation. Daniel had never betrayed her. He had simply, over the years, ceased to really see her. Now Julian had walked into the study and found the one small relic of the woman she had once been. Mara set the portfolio on the desk and closed the lid of the cedar chest with more force than necessary. It was foolish to keep them. Julian's voice was low when he answered. "No." It was human. She laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what we're calling regret now?" He said nothing to that. The house groaned softly around them as the wind rose outside. At last he straightened. "Daniel asked if I'd look at the water damage in the West Corridor before dinner. I only came up to tell you. Then tell me and go." A small pause. "There's water getting in near the ceiling rose," he said. "You should move the boxes away from that wall." He turned to leave, then stopped, one hand on the frame. "Mara." She hated the way her name sounded gentler in his voice than it had in years. "What?" "I was glad you kept them." Then he was gone. All through dinner, the house seemed to breathe differently. Daniel talked about permits, roofing estimates, and some tiresome disagreement at the Heritage Council. Mara nodded at the right moments, passed the salt, and said almost nothing. Julian, seated opposite her beneath the chandelier's pale light, was all restraint. He asked Daniel practical questions about the property boundaries and listened as if he had never stood in her study with the ghosts of another summer between them. And yet each time Mara lifted her wineglass, she felt his awareness, like a warmth on the back of her hand. It unsettled her in a way that was half dread, half awakening. Later, when Daniel fell asleep in his library chair with a history journal folded on his chest and the television murmuring to itself in another room, Mara went down to the kitchen for tea. The house at night belonged to echoes. Pipes ticking in the walls. Floorboards settling. The distant shudder of waves striking rock below the bluff. She set the kettle on and stood at the long farmhouse table, palms flat against the wood, willing herself into calm. "Couldn't sleep?" Julian's voice came from the doorway.
She did not startle this time.
She was too tired for that.
No.
He stepped inside, sleeves rolled to the elbows, hair still damp from a shower. There was an old wool sweater thrown over one shoulder, as if he had meant only to cross the hall and change his mind halfway there. "I could say the same to you," she said. He moved to the counter, took down a glass, then thought better of it and leaned against the sink instead. Rain had begun at some point without her noticing. It tapped softly at the kitchen windows. "For what it's worth," he said, "I really am sorry." She busied herself with the tea caddy. "About walking in on me? About making you feel exposed." The kettle began its low pre-boil murmur. Mara kept her eyes on the cups. "You didn't make me feel anything.
You just reminded me."
He watched her a moment. "Of what?" She almost said of being young. Almost said of being wanted before anyone had learned how easily I could adapt to being useful instead. Almost said too much. "Instead," she answered, "of a version of myself that doesn't exist anymore." Julian's face changed, not dramatically, but enough. "I don't think that's true." She gave him a flat look. "You've been here 3 days. That's long enough to see someone disappearing." The kettle shrieked. Mara snatched it off the stove too quickly, and hot water sloshed over her fingers. She hissed and turned toward the sink, but Julian was already there, taking her wrist gently, guiding her hand beneath the cold tap. His touch was brief, careful, absolutely decent, which made it far more dangerous than if it had not been. For a second, neither of them spoke. Cold water rushed over her skin. His hand remained around her wrist only long enough to be useful, then loosened, but not entirely. Mara looked up. Rain silvered the dark window behind him. The kitchen light caught the planes of his face, the seriousness in it, the thing he was making no real effort to hide now. "You should let go," she said. "Yes," Julian replied. He did not. The silence between them deepened until it seemed to have texture, something you could step into and not easily step back from. Then the lights went out. The whole kitchen dropped into darkness. For one suspended moment there was nothing but the rain, the sea, and the sudden bright thunder of Mara's own pulse. A flash of lightning tore across the sky outside, whitening the room. In that instant she saw him clearly, his hand still on her wrist, his face close, not presumptuous, not careless, but full of a restraint that looked very much like pain. When darkness returned, she pulled her hand free. "Don't," she whispered. He stepped back at once. "All right." The lights returned a moment later, dim and wavering before they steadied. The spell broke, but only outwardly. It had already gone somewhere deeper. Mara took her tea and left the kitchen without another word. That night, lying awake beside Daniel's even breathing, she stared at the ceiling and understood with a cold clarity that the danger was no longer Julian. The danger was that something inside her had answered. The next morning dawned colorless and wet. Daniel left early for a meeting in town. The housekeeper would not come until afternoon. The world smelled of rain, salt, and damp wood. Mara tried to occupy herself. She made calls, balanced invoices, directed a gardener over the phone about replacing the hydrangeas near the south wall. She even opened a novel and read the same paragraph 6 times without absorbing a word. By noon, she gave up and went to the conservatory at the back of the house, where potted lemon trees crowded the glass and the sea looked close enough to touch. Julian was there already. He stood on a ladder repairing a cracked window latch, tools spread out on a drop cloth beneath him. At the sound of her entering, he climbed down and wiped his hands on a rag. "I didn't know anyone was in here," he said. "I live here," Mara replied, sharper than she meant to. His mouth tilted, not a smile, exactly, but an acknowledgement.
Yes.
I deserve that. She should have turned around. She knew it. But the conservatory was full of rainlight and the scent of lemon leaves, and she was tired of behaving as if the room itself had done something wrong. So she went to the wicker chair near the window and sat. Julian returned to the ladder, though he did not resume working immediately. After a while, he said, "Do you still paint?" Mara looked out at the sea. "No, why not?" "Because some people stop." "That's not an answer." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "You've become very direct." "I was always direct." "You just only remember the summer version of me." "And what's the winter version?" Julian glanced at her then, one hand resting on the ladder rung. The one who's learned what silence costs. She wished he would say something easy, something charming and forgettable, a line she could dismiss, a mood she could blame on weather and confinement. But he kept speaking to the part of her she had spent years pressing beneath routine. Mara rose from the chair and crossed to the far end of the conservatory, where rain ran down the glass in narrow streams. "You shouldn't say these things to me. Would it help if I lied?"
"Yes."
He was quiet behind her. "No," he said at last. "It wouldn't." She turned then, too quickly, anger and fear tangling in her chest. "What do you want from me, Julian?" He did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was so steady it almost undid her. "Nothing you don't choose. Nothing you can't walk away from. But I won't pretend I don't see you." The words landed between them with almost unbearable softness. Mara folded her arms tight across herself. "You knew me for 12 days. He shook his head lightly.
"No."
"I knew you then for 12 days. I know this woman now because I have eyes." Rain drummed harder on the glass roof. A branch scraped the panes overhead. In the old, enormous house, with its locked rooms and polished silver and sleeping marriage, something fragile and wild stood up inside her and refused to lie back down. She hated him a little for that. More than that, she hated herself for being grateful. "I am not a girl on a terrace in Italy anymore," she said. Julian took one step toward her. "No more. I know. And this house is not a holiday. My life is here. I know that too. Then stop looking at me as if there is some other life hidden under this one." His expression changed just barely. "There is." Mara's throat tightened. How cruel, she thought, for truth to arrive in such a beautiful voice. She looked away first. When she spoke again, the force had gone out of her. "You should finish the latch." He nodded once. "All right." And because he was kinder than she wanted him to be, he did exactly that. That evening the storm returned in earnest. Wind hurled itself against the house. The sea rose, slate and furious, striking white against the rocks below. Daniel phoned to say the roads were flooding and he would stay overnight in town with a colleague rather than risk the drive back. Mara listened, said that was sensible, and set the receiver down very carefully. The house had never felt so large. She lit lamps in 3 rooms she did not intend to use. Poured a glass of wine. Put it down untouched. Went to the study, then left it. Opened a drawer, closed it. Picked up the leather portfolio and held it for a long time without untying the ribbon. A knock came at the door just after 9. Julian stood in the hallway, rain on his coat, hair blown wild by the wind. "The lower boathouse windows have gone," he said. "I've boarded what I can, but if the tide keeps rising, the old path may wash out by morning." Mara nodded. though the practical words barely reached her. "You're drenched." He glanced down at himself as if only now noticing. Occupational hazard. There was a pause in which the storm seemed to move closer around the house. Then Mara stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze." He hesitated only a fraction before entering. She found towels in the linen press, brought him one, then another. He stood near the hearth in the sitting room rubbing rain from his hair while she knelt to coax the fire higher. The room glowed amber and red. Wind hissed down the chimney. For several minutes they spoke only of weather, tide tables, old foundations, practical things. It should have remained there. It almost did. Then Julian's gaze drifted to the desk by the window. The portfolio lay there, untied. Mara followed his eyes. "I was trying to decide whether to burn them," she said. And apparently I'm more sentimental than I'd like to admit." He crossed the room slowly, not toward her at first, but toward the desk. He touched the edge of one charcoal sheet with the back of his fingers, almost reverently. "I'd forgotten this one." It was the sketch of her standing in a doorway somewhere in Positano, sunlight behind her, one hand lifting her hair off her neck. "You made me look braver than I was," Mara said. Julian turned.
No. I drew what I saw."
The fire snapped sharply in the grate. Mara stood very still. "Nothing happened," she said, though she did not know why she was saying it now, after all this time. "No, but it almost did."
"Yes."
"Why didn't it?" A flicker passed over his face. "Because you were leaving. Because I was young enough to believe dignity would save me from regret. Because sometimes not doing a thing changes you just as much as doing it." The storm battered the windows. Mara had the absurd thought that the whole house was listening. "And now?" she asked. Julian's voice dropped. "Now I think regret is just another room people learn to live in." The words undid the last of her careful balance. Not because they were seductive. Because they were true. She crossed the distance between them before she fully understood that she was doing it. Not into his arms, not yet, but close enough to see the rain still caught in his eyelashes, close enough to feel the heat from the fire and the colder heat of being looked at fully. For a long moment no one moved. Then Julian lifted a hand, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away, and touched one finger to the edge of the portfolio ribbon. "If I kiss you," he said, "it cannot be out of loneliness. And it cannot be because this house is empty tonight. It has to be because after all these years, you still want the life that wakes up when someone sees you." Mara closed her eyes. The sea boomed below the bluff. Wind pressed hard at the old glass. Somewhere upstairs, a door shifted on its latch. When she opened her eyes again, they burned. "I don't know what I want," she whispered. Julian's hand fell back to his side. "That," he said softly, "is the first honest thing you've said all day." A broken laugh escaped her then, brief, wet with tears she had not realized were there. And perhaps that saved them, or doomed them, depending on what one believes such moments are for. Because instead of kissing him, Mara turned away and sat at the desk. She pulled the nearest blank page toward her, found a pen, and stared at it as if it were something miraculous. Behind her, she heard Julian exhale. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled, but not with fear. "Stay," she said. "Just stay until the storm passes."
So he did.
Not beside her, but across the room in the chair by the fire, quiet as a witness. Mara sat at the desk while the house shuddered around them and began, for the first time in nearly 16 years, to write. Not about Italy. Not exactly about Julian. Not even about Daniel. She wrote about a woman in a house above a violent sea. A woman who had mistaken endurance for virtue and silence for peace. A woman who discovered, too late or just in time, that being seen was not the same as being taken, and that sometimes the most dangerous love affair is the one that returns a person to herself. She wrote until the storm moved farther out and the windows stopped rattling like teeth. When at last she looked up, the fire had gone low. Julian was still there, one arm over the chair back, watching her not with hunger now, but with something steadier. Recognition, perhaps. Mara set down her pen. The room felt altered.
So, did she?
Nothing had been solved. Morning would still come. Daniel would still return. The house would still need repairs. The tide would still drag its cold body in and out beneath the bluff as it had for 100 years. But something had shifted, and irreversibly. Not because she had stepped into another man's arms. Because she had stepped, however tremblingly, back into her own life. Outside, beyond the black windows, the sea kept breathing. And for the first time in years, Mara did not feel buried by the sound of it.